This episode was made possible by our incredible donors. Their faithful support allows us to continue the work of amplifying the voices of religious abuse survivors. We committed early on never to monetize any of the stories, so we rely solely on donations from people like you. If you value the work and are able to contribute, you can become a monthly donor at the link in our show notes. Another way to support Bodies Behind the Bus is by following, rating, and reviewing the podcast. It only takes a moment, but has a tremendous impact on our reach. Thank you for daring to listen.
Hello, and welcome back to the Bodies Behind the Bus podcast. We're super excited to have a special guest with us today. We have Beth Allison Barr, an incredible author who many of you, I believe, have probably read her first book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, with us today to talk to us about her next book that I absolutely loved. I sent her a message. I finished last night in preparation for this recording and had a good cry fest by the end of it. It is beautiful and informative and really just, I want to give you first off a huge congrats for this. You can tell it was a labor of love and hard work. So welcome to the podcast, Beth. We're so excited to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here too. So I've been listening to y'all for quite a while. So I'm thankful for your work.
Thank you. That's such an honor. I'd love for you to take just a minute here and explain I know it's you do a lot of it in your books, but a quick high level backstory on what got you here, what got you interested in writing books like Making a Biblical Womanhood or Becoming the Pastor's Wife. Just intro yourself a little.
Yeah, well, I'm a medieval historian, which doesn't necessarily lend itself to writing books like The Making of Biblical Womanhood or Becoming the Pastor's Wife. But I'm also a pastor's wife myself, and I have been married to a pastor in the evangelical world, mostly in the Baptist world, but also in the non-denominational world, since 1997. I also grew up in the Southern Baptist Church. That's the church that I came to faith in, and that was my childhood church. And so all of my adult life, I have been in this weird space where I have been engaged in academic studies that focus on women in the church, women in church history, especially in the medieval world. Although I am from the classics background, I actually had a classics minor and almost went into classics for my PhD. So I also have that background as well. And yet during my time as an aspiring academic, moving on to tenure track, having babies, all of that, my life was alongside my husband, who was and we both were in an evangelical church that was becoming increasingly conservative, especially regarding the views towards women. And that mix of things set me up to write The Making of Biblical Womanhood, which I often tell people was a last-ditch effort for sanity, for people to realize that what they were being taught about women was not actual reality. And that also gave me the groundwork for writing Becoming the Pastor's Wife, in which I got to tackle some questions I had left really unexplored in The Making of Biblical Womanhood, and that namely is women's ordination and what happened to women in paid professional ministry roles, and what did that look like in the past, and what has happened to that today.
It was so interesting to me to see, multiple points of both of your books, but there were some points of this book in particular that stuck out to me where you were so vulnerable about your own story. And it was an honor to read that on these pages. And I think there's going to be so many women, and I hope men too, that read this and are able to humanize the women that are in these roles and able to see the pressure and the expectations that you maybe didn't realize that you had for women that are married to pastors. Something that was shocking to me that I just did not know that comes from your historian background was the divorcing that happened historically. So
Oh,
like, can you walk us through that just a little bit? Because that was like mind blowing to me. And again, you can read like more in depth in the book, but just like give us a little taste of what that was in the past. I
so
thought it was, my mind is blown by that.
so are you talking about the fact I tell a story about a particular pastor's wife who in the 19th century in the Southern Baptist world actually divorces her pastor's husband? Are you talking about that one or
No. So
okay.
I am talking about, I think it was medieval times
Oh,
when it became important for clergy to not be married anymore.
that one. Okay.
Yeah. I had no idea that people were married. And then in order to stay past priests, whatever it was, just divorce their wives. So
Yes.
these women are just like basically left destitute or called concubines.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. I think,
What?
this is one of I'm really excited you wanted to start with that part because I think so much of this story about how we got to where we are today really is rooted in the medieval world. And the medieval world is often something we want to set aside as Protestants as like, that's a totally different thing that has nothing to do with us. But honestly, the creation of a clerical role that is focused on, this pastoral authority that often is also focused on communion or Eucharist, transforming the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ. We think of these as things that have always been a part of the male pastoral role, and we don't realize that they have a history too. And part of their history is the story of the medieval church trying to separate itself from lay control, from the control of kings and princes, etc. And in order to do this, they had to separate themselves from their families. And from the families of these aristocratic lords, which meant that they had to disown their wives and their children. And there is, one of the students, she was a student who started after me in graduate school, and worked with my same advisor. This was actually what she worked on, and I cite her in the book, which is actually really fun, Janelle Werner. But she worked on what happened to these wives of clergy who were bona fide married and had children, and lived these ordinary lives within the medieval villages, and yet they had to be put away by their husbands, disowned, divorced, if you will, although mostly it was kind of like being an annulled marriage, and their status significantly reduced in order to upgrade the status of their husbands. And it's a terrible story. It is also tied to the rise of, or maybe not the rise, but the sanctioning of prostitution in the medieval world, where we have all of these brothels that some of them are controlled by the church, run by the church, and also have clergy that participate and help support these brothels.
When I tell you that my jaw was on the floor, like honestly, all of it was like click, 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 click into place with where we're at, specifically in the Southern Baptist Convention. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
this makes sense. I don't know why this is shocking, but like that. It is shocking reading this on these pages and seeing like the historical it's proof. And I feel weird having to say that now, but we're in a season of the world where you have to be like, there's proof. It's real. We're not making this up. But oh my gosh. It is absolutely mind-blowing to me that this
Yeah.
was just sanctioned by the church, done in God's name. Women were harmed. Children were harmed, and men were just allowed to do it. Like,
Yeah.
what?
Well, and that's the thing too, is I think we have evidence. We know that a lot of clergy actually fought against this. because they didn't want to leave their wives. They didn't want to leave their children. Some of them actually just kept living with them and trying to ignore these sanctions and these things that they were told to do for as long as possible. But yet at the same time, in order for them to continue being clergy and continue doing the role that they felt called to do, they were more and more forced to separate from their family. And so, I mean, I wish we had more. We do have some evidence, but I wish we had more stories of women of what it was like to live through this. And because I can only imagine it must have been horrific.
Absolutely. Jay, I read ahead of him, so I know I'm ahead of him. So I was sending him like sections, like make sure you read this before the interview, because for everyone who doesn't know, we've mentioned it a couple of times on the podcast, but his whole community is in literal national emergency crisis because he lives right where those fires are. But Jay, when you're hearing this, what are you thinking over there?
Well, I mean, I did start to read it, and I read a good chunk of it, and so far I've really enjoyed it. It felt like a continuation from your previous book, which I loved. Your other book. I mean, I think you wear your professions very well and how you write. Being a historian and a professor. But you're very articulate in bringing us into the world of what it is to be in the SBC. So, I mean, John, I have not gotten to that part, but I think it doesn't surprise me. When I read your work, what doesn't surprise me is how, I think you mentioned this at one point about how we've created traditions in our space, especially traditions in white Christian churches, and we've just accepted that as faith. And just accepted it as sacred faith. And it's not. And when you peel those layers back and see the rich history that we have, a diverse history, it is eye-opening because it allows us to engage the scriptures and faith in a different way. So I am incredibly appreciative of that. However, you are saying things that in our current context are not good for a lot of people. I mean, I think of the bishop who had the lovely sermon a few days ago and the wisdom that she profound and how unhinged the men are by what she said. So how, approaching this subject in the context that we are today seems extra risky. It seems, I mean, you are putting a lot out there. How do you approach that? How do you take all of that into consideration, knowing that we are in a time where we seem to be regressing even more and doubling down on things that, if you look at the broader faith, especially from a historical perspective, are not accurate or right in any way?
Right. No, I think that's why we need to be even louder. Because people have to realize that what they are being told is not actually reality. When you look at church history, when you look at even the Bible itself, the things that people are teaching about women's place and women's relationship to their husbands and women's relationship to God are not historical constants. They may appear at different points in the past, but that doesn't mean that there aren't alternative visions that are also going on. It also doesn't mean that they are biblically accurate. People have been misusing the scripture for the entirety of Christian history. And so, and what's interesting to me as a historian is both the continuities in how we misuse scripture, but also the differences. And so I tell my students all the time, I'm like, look, just because something looks the same doesn't mean it is the same. Just because women have a more challenging time being priests in the medieval world does not mean the reasons for that are the same as what the Southern Baptist Convention is doing right now. And those historical differences matter because they show us that these responses to women are based in culture and not actually based in the Bible. Because as culture changes, our attempts to oppress people also change. And I think, a historical continuity is oppression. is our attempts to oppress people who are different than us and maintain the status quo of power that supports small groups of people. But how we do that changes significantly over time. And as a historian, that's what I'm interested in.
Mic drop. On that note, something that I have underlined here that really popped out at me and that I think goes along with what you're saying was one of the chapters it's again back in the Middle Ages, so apparently that part of the book really hit me.
I'm so excited by that because that is my sweet spot.
Yes, it was fascinating. But you're talking about describing women as extraordinary being a subtle way of reinforcing the patriarchy. And I was like, oh, look at her go.
I'm glad you picked up on that. This is something that comes from me as a teacher because I have this all the time. I just taught my first section of my European women's history class. And I taught the medieval course last fall. And in fact, I talk about one of the exercises I use in that class, which is the disputatio. And it's the sic et non, the yes and no. And it was a medieval assignment. And one of the things that, I have my students often do is like take these statements that sometimes women are never able to be in leadership in the same ways as men. And I'm like, okay, take that statement. And from the sources that we used, I want you to write affirmative responses and negative responses to it, using only the material that we have. And what I find, and this really helps show to my students, is that women have always been doing the same types of leadership roles as men. But when we look at it, on the one hand, we can look at it and be like, oh, yes, there are some women who do this, but they are always extraordinary. And they are always on the sort of outside of this. And so they are the exceptions that support the rule. But if you flip that and look at it the other way, what you see is that everything a man is doing, women are also doing that. So the question is why are we trying to explain women doing it away as extraordinary when the record shows us that it isn't extraordinary? That women like Hildegard of Bingen, who was extraordinary in the sense that she was so smart, she wrote so much of it survives. That's really why she's extraordinary, because so much of it survives. But yet, there were women like her all over the medieval world who were in charge of monasteries, who were exercising spiritual authority over men, who were preaching to men, sanctioned by the papacy, sanctioned by their bishops and archbishops, and exercising spiritual authority, pastoral authority over their communities. So if we define these women as extraordinary, what we are simply doing is trying to write them off as being the norm. I mean, saying women are extraordinary in leadership is saying women don't really belong in leadership. And that's not what the historical record shows.
Which was, again, shocking to me. I had no idea that women had these roles throughout history and that it was more like normalized. It wasn't unusual. You do a good job of showing us that like more men held these roles, but it wasn't an insignificant amount of women that were doing this. One of the lines that you have in here is categorizing women who function as pastors as exceptional maintains the fiction that women are not pastors. Right. And if that doesn't hit home today, I don't know what does. I mean, we have so many ministry gifted women that have told their stories on this podcast that have been told, be a pastor's wife or are pastors' wives, that were actually encouraged in Bible school or in seminary. If you want to do ministry, then you need to marry a pastor. There literally is no space for them to hear, and a lot of them didn't get married. We have single women on this podcast who are doing ministry, not as pastors, but doing pastoral work.
Right.
And this language, this idea that we have made female pastors extraordinary or exceptional is actually harming the work going forward. The work is normalizing the actual work that is happening right now
Right.
in these spaces.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and I mean, this is what's so crazy about institutions like the Southern Baptist Convention, is that they cannot survive without the support of women. And some parts that I would like to do more with this. I didn't get to get into it as much. I got into it some in this book. But one of the things that I found in the Southern Baptist Archives, and this is something that historians have known for a while, is that the Southern Baptist Convention stayed alive because of the money raised by women, like with the Women's Missionary Union, the WMU. And even like the pastor's wife conference, the minister's wife conference, which I talk about in the book, which was a really extraordinary group of women who, and they're still around today, although there has been significant changes in what that organization has done. But the minister's wife's conference, they couldn't get stable funding for themselves. And this was a group of women in the Southern Baptist Convention who got together and were like, all of these women are getting thrown into this role. They have no training. They have no support. They have no help. Let's start meeting together and supporting each other. That's essentially what started. I mean, so it's this really wonderful story of women coming together to help each other. And they had a hard time getting funding for it. And in fact, there's one time they wrote this one pastor and he's like, I don't think y'all need this. I mean, you have the Southern Baptist Convention. Why do you need this? And it's, sort of like, why do you need a separate thing for women? And so they just kind of ignored him and just kept on. And finally, they open up a fund that people could contribute to allow them not to have to keep begging for money every time they wanted to meet. And that fund grew so fast and got so big that the Southern Baptist Convention actually took it over and got and that was one of the things that that we were trying. And so that money then got pulled in. And I have no idea what it is being used for and what, et cetera. But during the time of around Dorothy Patterson era, when we see a shift in the Minister's Wives Conference, that fund got absorbed into the Southern Baptist Convention's larger budget. But it was, they literally could not have survived without the ministry and gifting and fundraising of women.
And free labor.
Free labor.
Free
Still
labor.
today.
That's exactly right.
The funds are probably going to Project 2025. So
I'm not going to speculate for legal reasons.
Yeah, just kidding.
But we were actually, when I was in the archives, I was with Savannah Locke.
How are you allowed in the archives? I would think your picture would be on the wall.
And
they'd be like, this lady, this person, this individual, no, we don't want her in this.
I will give a shout out to the archivists at Southern Baptist Archives. They have been so welcoming towards me.
That's awesome.
Because they're researchers. And they also, and the Southern Baptist story is not just a story of oppression and harm. It is also a story of people trying to move away from that. And you have, these stories, and women were a huge part of this, of trying to change what the Southern Baptist Convention was rooted in, and trying to move towards a more, I would say, gospel-centered way. And that was what was really shut down in the 1980s. And so the Southern Baptist Archives are full of these extraordinary stories and also of where it went wrong. And so I think many of the archivists are very welcoming of people who will come in and show the diversity of voices that were a part of the SBC history. But I will also say that I worry every single time I write an archivist and ask if I can come. It stresses me out because I know that I am probably impacting, them in some way, just because I'm in the archives. And so I worry about that. But the archivists at the SBC have been fantastic and welcoming me just like an ordinary researcher.
Well, props to the archivists.
Shout out archivists. Yeah.
I mean, that's beautiful. I think one of the things about, you said free labor, John, I think that too was something, Beth, when I read your work and, the idea that women are really exhausting themselves at all costs and receive zero credit, very little even notoriety, anything, empathy. And you coming from that spot, I know you share your story in the initial book about what that was like, but I mean, coming from that place, like how, if you could take us back, carrying that burden, what is that like? Because you are not a quiet individual, nor should you be. And you are a
Yeah.
smart, educated individual with talents. How do you try to extinguish that flame inside of you with the burden of saying you need to be quiet?
Yeah, no, well, I think for me, it has been helpful being in the occupation that I'm in because I have been encouraged by so many people. And in the world of academia, you're always writing the evidence out there, testing it, getting it peer reviewed, getting people's responses, both negative and positive responses. And then you have to deal with that. And it kind of teaches you how to take rejection well, how to take constructive criticism. I think it would, well, anyway, I won't say that, but I was going to say, I think it would help a lot of SBC pastors if they actually went through true academia. I'll just leave that out there because it teaches you how to be wrong and how to get better and how to be humble about that. And one of the things that I really have struggled with this book is, on the one hand, my heart is with all these women who, whether or not they knew they were complicit, whether or not they whether or not they felt called into ministry, they have been serving in these positions alongside their husbands for decades. And when we see the big shift in the pastor's wife sort of role, and I talk about that in the book, but they have been doing this for an extremely long time, and they have made a huge difference in the lives of so many people. And so I want to value that even, some of them, this is all they knew. This is all they had ever been taught. This is all their pastor's wife books that they were reading taught them to do. And so they weren't intentionally causing harm. They were honestly doing what they thought God was calling them to do. And so I want to be sympathetic and empathetic to those women, because I know what that was like. But yet at the same time, the reality is what we have done with the role of the pastor's wife has been harmful. It has harmed the way that we have positioned it as the best ministry role for women, has harmed women who feel called to independent ordained ministry. And we have to reckon with that. We have to reckon with the fact that churches have their default position is, when a woman says she feels called to ministry, is, oh, well, you're probably called to marry a minister. That response has caused a lot of harm. And so we have to reckon with both those things. And I wrote and rewrote chapters trying to hold those two things in tension.
Yeah, I have one comment, because I remember this from the early chapters of the book, when you were engaged to your husband, and that woman came up to you and said,
Yes.
"Oh, you belong to him." And
Yeah.
even reading it, I was like blown away by like the way you wrote it. There was such certainty in the sentence, to where it was like, nope, like not even an afterthought to that individual, that you
Yes.
belong to her. Like, did that send chills up your spine, or like how, like in that moment, like how were you processing that moment when that was said to you so many years ago?
Yeah. So, I mean, it probably says something about me. On the one hand, I was raised in this church where women's voices were silenced and pushed secondary to men. But yet at the same time, um, I was raised in a family that has a very strong history of women like me. I could give you lots of examples of that. And my voice was never silenced in my home. And I was never taught that getting married, and I was never taught that getting married meant moving into a subordinate role within my home. I certainly did not see that with my parents. um, and so in some ways it was sort of shocking to me, even though I had grown up in this culture, to suddenly see these ideas about what I should be and who I should be being imposed upon me. by people in the church. And I just grit my teeth and shut my mouth a lot in the first part of my life. In fact, for a long time, for almost 20 years as a pastor's wife, that's what I did. But I remember the shock and I'll say anger. I didn't like that woman very much. I had a hard time um, remembering to be nice sometimes after that, because and there was lots of other things too that she wasn't my
I
favorite.
mean,
But
was she attached to that T-shirt? Who gave you the T-shirt? I was like,
no, that
oh
was a
my gosh.
different church. That was a different church. The Workers at Home T-shirt. Yeah, that was a different church. No, this woman, it was just this weird understanding of that a pastor's wife not only belongs to her husband, but she belongs to the church.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the pressure that puts on women is just extraordinary. I told a story about a woman when my husband was in seminary, who was a friend of mine and who cracked under that pressure. And so as I said, I want to let people know that I know how hard this life has been. And that these are women who have really been trying to do the work of God within the constraints that are placed around them.
It's so tied, in my mind at least, to the roots of the Southern Baptist Convention and this idea of owning people. And that, I mean, she just blatantly said it to you. There's
Yeah.
this idea that women, or like in the beginning, slaves, chattel slavery, enslaved people
Yes.
are an object to be owned, and that is their role in society. And it's so anti-Christ and anti-biblical. It's not who God created us to be, yet not just in the SBC. I appreciated a lot that you stayed within your realm of expertise and knowledge in your work. You stay pretty deeply in the Southern Baptist tradition, but like, we do see it across the board.
Yes.
These are stories that we hear with their different little sprinkling of weird flavor, depending on what the thing was that the controversy or the scandal is, But it is interesting to see the fruit of the roots of the Southern Baptist Convention played out across the board, but in your book, specifically towards pastors' wives. And I really, really appreciated that you talked about the taxes. I was like, we talk about this all the time, and I feel like people do not understand it.
The money, follow the money.
Follow the money. Women that are married to pastors, even though they're working for free, they are reaping the benefits of the tax break because their husbands get it, which is so gross and unfortunate. And we could probably spend 2 hours ranting about that in general. But women that are pursuing ministry, in particular in the Southern Baptist Convention now, especially now that they have taken away, didn't they vote to take away the title of minister?
Yeah, I mean,
from women.
What this means is that women are not eligible. Women who are doing the same work as men, regardless of what you call it, are not able to get the same financial advantages of doing this work. And I say in the book, I'm not exactly sure how this fits yet in this picture, but it has to be a part of what's going on.
It absolutely fits. And I will tell you, so my story, I was not married to I'm not married to a pastor. And I was a worship leader. If I was a dude, Jay, would you agree that I would have been called a worship pastor?
You were a worship minister, but you didn't get that title because you were a woman. So
right. And I remember going to this Acts 29 conference. I'm sitting at this Acts 29 conference, and I hear a pastor's wife, actually, who went on to become our pastor's wife, doing this big lesson about like all these exciting things that she's doing for pastors' wives in the Acts 29 network, and this initiative, and like they're raising them up to be teachers and all this stuff. And I was like, I'm so excited to hear that you care about women. I went up to her afterwards. I was like, but like, where do I fit in this picture? Because I have no support. I'm here at this conference co-leading with someone on this
Yep.
stage. I got to pray once, which was shocking. Um, but like, I want to grow in these things. Like, I want to be poured into. And that was something that I was like passionately seeking during my tenure at that job, was like, I want to grow and be better at what I was really asking for, was shepherding,
Yeah.
pastoring skills. Like, I want to grow that in me. I feel a love for that. And her answer was like, there's nothing for that.
Right. Yeah.
And so where it fits in the conversation is that it again is reinforcing your only space, the only time you will be poured into, the only development that you will get is if you marry a pastor.
Yep.
You will not get that in these spaces outside of being in that role.
Yeah, 100%. Not only will you not get that unless you marry a pastor, but you also have to follow the rules as a pastor's wife, and including having children. And this was something that I tried to get at too, is that this enormous pressure put on pastors' wives within these conservative evangelical spaces, to produce children and to prove that their primary role is in those children and their husbands, in a sense. But
All while
yeah,
doing all the extra stuff that you
right.
talk about in the book.
That's
All
exactly right.
while getting your leadership development and teaching the classes and, the Patterson way, where she's like keeping the women in line. I was telling my therapist recently that I could have been a shining star of the like conservative. You guys all say evangelical. I say evangelical. Is
I think
evangelical
it's
the right
just
way
a
to say
different.
it?
I don't think it
I was
matters.
like,
It's tomato, tomato. It's okay.
every time we have the smartest guests, they say evangelical, and I was like, am I the problem?
My son's girlfriend actually just asked me that. She's from California. She's like, is it evangelical or evangelical? And I was like, you can say it however you want.
Maybe it's our California, Arizona
Yeah.
Valley girl tendency here. Saying to my therapist,
Yeah.
I could have fit that because with my personality and with my giftings, if I would have just gotten in line and then utilized the parts of my personality that are stronger to keep other women in line and to
totally.
sell a lifestyle, like I could have been making great money right now and been living my best life, singing songs on stages, like that. There is spaces that you can fit into, but you have to stay in line. And
Exactly right. It's exactly
Beth,
right.
you didn't stay in line.
I didn't. I'm not real good about that. It's one of the things I want to go back to thinking about how exhausting this is for women, that even for women who are doing that, who are the shining stars, I'm not going to name names here, but we can all think about, the women who have done this and are still doing this. I actually have a lot of sympathy for them. Because I cannot, they have this burden to teach and to fulfill this pastoral role, and to do the work that God has given them to do. But if they are seen as moving too far one way or being too friendly with this person or something such as this, they lose that really fast, because that platform is not based upon belief in their ministry. It is based on whether or not they are helping support that male platform. And if they move on that or do anything at all, it just is over so fast. And, and we can think about, like Lifeway, which is a publishing arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, is notorious for having canceled women's books, and just being like, nope, we're not publishing you. You're out. Because you did this, because you were friendly to this person, because you used the word vagina, which is, of course, what happened to Rachel Held Evans in her book, which is just crazy. But they're all of a sudden put on the outs, simply because they were showing Christian hospitality to someone, or et cetera. So it's a really stressful line. And then, of course, the other side of that is they can get their husbands fired. And I'm still living with the repercussions of that, of having, cost my husband in many ways his career. I mean, he's not upset about it, but it's hard and I can say this personally, it is really hard to get hired if you are a man called to ministry and you lose your job because you step out of the lines too. It's really hard to get back into ministry spaces without doing like total relocating everything, which is extremely disruptive to families and, to all sorts of other things. And so this is such a harsh atmosphere, such a rigid atmosphere that causes so much stress about people just trying to stay in the lines. It's just bizarre to me.
And you did a really good job of touching on like the tangible repercussions of going out of the lines. But the spiritual component here cannot be overlooked. The pressure that you are harming the church, that you are harming God's mission, that you are going to cause people to fall away from the Lord and go to hell. All of those pressures on top of all of the other risks just can't be overlooked. And again, Beth, you do a great job of not giving excuses for complicity, but it behooves us all to have more empathy and to humanize each other more and to see what women are up against in these spaces.
Yeah, and I think too, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this in just a minute, but this also ties into the domestic abuse problem and sexual abuse problem within these very conservative spaces like the SBC. And one of the things I hear all the time is, why don't they just leave? Why do women put up with this? And those questions show me that those people have no idea what it is like to live as a woman in some of these spaces. And they have no idea what it's like to try to protect your kids and try to protect, what you can protect as much as you can, while trying to possibly even get help. But, if you think about these women who have been taught that their only thing to be is to be a support for their husbands, that's their God-given role. And with the horrific evangelical fixation on sex, and that women's primary job as a wife is to fulfill all of her husband's sexual desires, which is also hugely problematic. And then we put that with her primarily being a stay-at-home mom, which means she has less access to resources, less access to, what happens, what are all those like, does she even have a credit card in her own name? This is something you see a lot. Like, I've been watching shepherding movement style church growing in Waco. And one of the things that I've heard over and over again from people in small groups there is the women getting in trouble for spending more than $500 without their husband's permission or having separate financial accounts. And this is, and women are told that they're being selfish for doing this. But what do you do if you have no credit? If you don't have a separate line, how do you get out of these dangerous situations? So we've created this perfect storm for women that doesn't give them any real options to get out.
I was just going to say, I know, Johnny, you have a question, but when you described Dorothy, is it Dorothy Patterson?
Dorothy Patterson, yeah.
How she described Mary and her spirit, quiet, and it happened, quiet spirit. Anyways, the way she's insinuating what she's insinuating in that for women, it sent chills down my spine to think that she's preaching that to women, and to put myself like in the perspective to say, what were those women thinking when they received that information, especially if they were in homes that were already abusive, and to now have, at the time, a prominent voice basically say, this is my words, like, that's just life. Like, that's what you do. I was like, how do you even reconcile that? And where do you go with all of those stories? And are they lost forever? Because this is what's just perceived as what you do as a pastor's wife.
Yeah. No, it's exactly right. And of course, what you're referencing, and I used Amy Peeler's wonderful book, Women and the Gender of God, And when she pushes against this idea that women's role in the sex act is defined by God to be a receptacle and to submit. I mean, teaching women that it's submissive, that their sexual partnership should be submissive. I mean, this is just laying the groundwork for rape culture. And this is what we see theologically being done in these conservative spaces, with even teachings about Mary, about the mother of God, and even turning her somewhat into a rape victim. This, which I know some people may be shocked by that, but just think about when you are told that you have no choice and that your job is to submit your body for the use of a man, and that you have no choice and no control over that. That's rape. That's what it is. And women are being taught that this is normal, that they don't have they can't say no within their marriages. One, I didn't use it in the book because I was being very careful with my citations, and I couldn't find. I have the video exists. You can listen to it like on the internet, and I actually know what source it's from, but I couldn't find a citation for that source and for other people to go and find it who didn't have access to it. But it's this video recording of Dorothy Patterson telling a story about this woman who came to her whose husband was abusing her. And she told her that it was her fault for not being a good enough wife, and that her job was to go home, to quit her job, to quit her schooling, and to learn to be a submissive wife, and that would fix the marriage. And, she even says, well, he whopped her one. And I mean, she says that in the recording. And she's telling women that this is their fault when this happens, because they are not fulfilling their role as wife enough. And their husbands, it's understandable that their husbands are taking it out on them this way.
Well, then we have John Piper being like, it's
Yes.
like almost lionizing women who stay in abusive marriages. Like,
Yep.
this is your cross to bear, and like you're being faithful to stay if you get hit once or twice.
Yes.
Just
It's
awful.
yeah, no, and that, this is a long story. I mean, I tell a story in the book about a early Christian saint who was lionized for not speaking ill of her very abusive husband. And this story still resonates with women today.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to go. I mean, I'm happy to talk more about that, but I think the way you wrote it, by the time I got to that uncovering of who that saint is and how it fits into your book, I was a weeping mess, and I want people to go on that journey.
I
It's like
understand.
a
No,
spoiler alert to talk about it.
I understand that. It's that chapter 8, and I won't give anything away with it. It was not something I was looking for when I started out this book.
Mm-hmm.
It has been such a journey for me. I'm highly stressed about telling that story because there are real people who are involved. And as I said, I've gone through all the appropriate sort of things to do, including receiving permission. But it still is such a heartbreaking story. And I remember one of the people I interviewed for it, and when I still had this, I was like, because I actually asked specifically if I could tell the story of this woman, and the answer was yes, because I want people to know. And the response when I asked again, because I'm like, are you sure? We're still, I can still pull this, I can still do things, can change things. And the response was, may this story help other women, and may it provide correction for those who need it. And that, to me, I was just like, I've just been holding those words, and that's my prayer for this story, is that it helps women and it provides correction for a church that desperately needs it.
To give a little bit of context about the story that she is talking about, it's woven so beautifully into this book. And it really shines a light on how deeply entrenched the abuse of women is within the Southern Baptist Convention, and the crisis that is clergy sexual abuse that is longstanding within the Southern Baptist Convention, and the lack of integrity and the lack of courage and the lack of care at the highest levels for so long. And it's just, I mean, I immediately texted a couple of my like SBC sources.
Yeah.
They're gonna die laughing when they hear that, friends. That I ask for like all of my SBC inner
Yeah.
knowledge stuff. And there was not really like, no one knew.
Mm-mm. Yeah, this story has
So
been hidden. I mean,
hidden.
yeah,
It's been hidden. So get this book, read it, and then come into my mentions so I can talk to you about it. Anyone who is listening to this episode, this book comes out in March. Buy the book, pre-order it now, and then, like I said, come into my mentions on social media because I want to talk about this. As you're unraveling that story and just doing such a beautiful job of honoring her in it, you say some things that I underlined that I want to hit on before we let you go.
Yeah.
You're talking about the SBCs all of the sudden caring deeply to the point of it taking over a whole convention in 2023 about not allowing women into ministry roles that have like minister or pastor. And you say a couple things. You said this actually for MSNBC. At a time when they should be listening to the voices of women and lamenting the sex abuse scandals still rocking the denomination, the Southern Baptist world has chosen to strengthen the voices and the power of men. I can't begin to imagine the cost. And then you actually go on to say, that wasn't entirely true, though. I could imagine at least some of the cost. And I think our listeners, our longtime listeners, can also imagine the cost because they're hearing it almost every single time a story is released. So the Southern Baptist Convention is so wide-reaching that it touches so many Americans, so many women. And even if you're just from Acts 29 and you're not dual affiliated, which congrats if you're not, look deeper, you probably are.
You probably are.
Like those are where pastors are being developed. That's where they are going for their, what's it called when you go for like continuing
education.
Yeah,
seminary.
Let's
continuing.
use some big air quotes on that continued education, though. I mean, it is so far reaching and it's so costly and it's so, I mean, we're never going to know. The fact you found this story of, we can say her name is Maria.
Yes.
Maria's story in the archives. How many stories are buried that weren't in archives, that no one wrote letters about, that no correspondence exists about? I mean, I was like already a like emotional mess during starting at Maria's story through the end, but seeing Krista Brown and Megan Lively's names in your book was so beautiful. I really appreciated that you took the time to shout out these survivors who have been on the front lines for so long.
Yeah.
Fighting for women to be seen and protected, children to be seen and protected. You talk about the fact that there were so many signs for Maria, who is wrapped up in this story of her husband committing clergy sexual abuse to a congregant. Spoiler alert, it's covered up. And I'm like, no one's even surprised by that. That's not, that's like the highest level of the story. Right. Yeah. But she has all of these signs. Like it was every single sign of someone who desperately needs help, desperately needs the church. And you say they didn't know because I don't think they asked. And it harkens back so much to the reason we have this podcast and our first episode that we dropped and our tagline that we put on everything, that thank you for daring to listen. This elder says all the signs were there, but no one ever dared to listen.
Yep.
It was too risky to listen. And you see it throughout time. You see it in these stories of wives who were in the medieval times and children abandoned for the sake of the gospel, and I mean, put out on streets in some cases, families that are being divided. We're seeing it in our country today. We're seeing the gospel used to divide families today. It's just a mess. And I think this work is so important for us. So important for us. I mean, you go on to say during this time that this culture teaches men that it's okay to forgive and forget. When a man admits to causing harm to a woman and her family, it allows such a man to remain in ministry until his voluntary retirement. Yep. The SBC thought it was more important to vilify women preaching the gospel than to protect the sexual victims of male pastors. I mean, my goodness. You brought fire.
Well, that describes the past 40, 50 years of what we see going on in the Southern Baptist Convention and spilling out. You know, as I said, this is something that I've tried to help people see too, that all these circles are connected and that the SBC overlaps with, Acts 29, which you are very familiar with. Of course, and I don't live very far from Dallas. And so I hear from lots of those stories too. It's also in the growth of these non-denominational churches that are, I think you're absolutely right that part of this is the training that's coming out of these spaces. A lot of these churches where they're now hosting their own little, like training year or two things that they're not really seminaries, but they're like discipling people into ministry. And so instead of people going to reputable seminaries where they can actually learn a diversity of and Christian history, etc., they're going and being trained up in these abusive spaces by these pastors who are teaching them to go and perpetuate this same type of, and without any set clear doctrinal training or understanding of church history. And this is so dangerous. And you think about even in the SBC, which did have really reputable seminaries for a long time, they were good. And what they did is they took over them and they took control of all of the voices. And there's still good professors in many of those seminaries. But again, they're living in these really hard spaces where they have to be very careful about what they say and what they teach, which means that their students are not getting the type of exposure and the type of understanding to Christian history and theology and practice that they should be. And this is just, touches, even if you are not SBC, if you are in a non-denom, white, evangelical, conservative church, you have been influenced in some way by the Southern Baptist Convention.
And if you're a missionary, you absolutely have been influenced by it.
Yeah, the missionaries. That's a whole nother, somebody was like, are you going to talk about missionary wives? And I was like, oh my gosh.
Maybe my next book.
Yeah, one of my best friends is actually grew up in the mission field. And one of my students, actually, she now is out with her PhD, but she actually grew up in the Southern Baptist mission field. She was a missionary kid. It's so that is a whole nother, but also related, similar dynamics that we see going on. And I think we think about missionary spaces. The shock that I hear all the time from women is that they are allowed to do so much out on the mission field. And there's racism in this too, because, they're just caring for people of color and people who are non-white and non-Western. And so in some ways there's an equivalent status of children. And so women are able to exercise full pastoral function in those areas. But then when they come back home, they're not able to do those things. And it's whiplash for women, but it is also the reasoning behind it is infused with this racist ideology.
Yeah, at the end of the book, and I don't want to give away your last chapter, but you do a great job of recentering and saying there is hope. And you spell out kind of a formula for hope. What blew me away, though, is the fact that, especially in the current climate that we have, the way you articulated how to look at hope and how we move forward was wonderful. And it resonated with me, and I was like, this is so much wisdom here that we could all really glean from and learn from. It involves a curiosity, but also a repentant spirit that I'm not sure we're capable of as a white-centered church. But what it did leave me with was, I know there's probably churches that will do this and can do this. And so the encouragement that I would say, I mean, from that last chapter, do you have that hope still, especially in the climate that we're in, especially after, the election and what we're seeing so far coming from places to where politics and Christendom are being more, white Christendom are being more married together, and really that force is becoming something to where we're all going to have to reckon with one way or another?
Yes, I do have hope. I think, though, my hope comes not from my current circumstances at all, but it comes from knowing the history of the church and the history of faithful people. And that God, I mean, I remember, learning all through about how people always find God, and how God is always faithful. And that we will persevere. And that women and men have always seen the difference between cultural Christianity and the heart of Christ. And people not seeing it is a long part of history. This is not actually something surprising historically. It's just hard when you have to be the person living through it. But historically, this is not surprising. This is what happens when Christianity gets tied up with empire and wealth. And so in some ways, it's a very common story. But God always shines through that, and people see. And so my hope is in that history, that people will see, and the gospel, the heart of Christ, will continue to help this world.
So beautiful. I feel like the appropriate way to send off for an episode like this with Beth Allison Barr is go be free. Go be free. If you are a pastor's wife or a former pastor's wife and you are hearing this and you are resonating with the weight that you have carried, this is just an encouragement to you that you can shake that off. That is not of God. There are not spiritual consequences to you putting down the burdens that the world has put on your shoulders, taking some breaths, and chasing after freedom. And maybe go read some books by some Black pastors' wives, because they are going to put the fire of God under your butt, sister. And Beth does talk about that in the book. So again, what day exactly is this coming out?
March 18th is when it releases.
March 18th. I have had so many people in my mentions like, I've already pre-ordered it. When am I getting it? When am I getting it? If you haven't, we will put the link in the show notes. Order it. I think that it is going to be just as monumental in people's journeys as Making of Biblical Womanhood. And, we have the trifecta. We have Making of Biblical Womanhood, Great Sex Rescue, Jesus and John Wayne. That was like, everybody's jumping in the deep end together. Here we go. I think this is a beautiful next step for people as we are starting to kind of parse through swimming up to the surface. Where do we go from here? So thank you again for your work, your commitment to hope, your witness of hope, and your historical witness as well. Thank you for centering the voices of people who are not centered often. Thank you for telling Maria's story. I know it changed me. Thank you to Maria's family for letting you tell that story. And I cannot wait to see what this book does in the world. Congratulations.
Thank you. It was so wonderful talking with you.